Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story, where each weekday we offer a brief lesson from a section of today's reading from the One Year Bible, and we examine some questions that extend our learning from the sermon on Sunday. Today I'm joined by Rivenbark and Alyssa Bream, and we're looking at a passage from Mark chapter 3, verses 31 through 35. So we were in Mark 3 yesterday as well. Alyssa, will you read the text for us today?
Then Jesus' mother and brothers came to see him. They stood outside and sent word for him to come out and talk with them. There was a crowd sitting around Jesus, and someone said, "Your mother and your brothers are outside asking for you." Jesus replied, "Who is my mother? Who are my brothers?" Then he looked at those around him and said, "Look, these are my mother and brothers. Anyone who does God's will is my brother and sister and mother." So we saw conflict with Jesus and his family yesterday, a few verses ago. So what is going on in these verses as we continue reading?
It seems like the family is trying to intervene in his ministry, right? The fact that they're standing outside kind of gives us some indication that they're trying to assert some control over him. And I think that as strong as family ties are among the average Christian community, Jewish culture, the family ties carried significant weight. I mean, lots of pressure, even still, this is not just in that day, it's still true today, that's the case. And so they were almost saying, like, we're family, you owe us your attention. And in light of, what we discussed yesterday, it may have been an attempt to separate Jesus from the crowd, take him away, if you will. And you can imagine how shocked they were when they hear Jesus redefine what family is. And because Jesus says things like, "Following me creates a connection that supersedes your biological ties or societal norms." And those who do God's will, they become Jesus' brother, his sister, his mother. And it's interesting, for the first time in the Gospel of Mark, that the followers of Jesus are giving this explicit in-group definition, right? You're part of members of the in crowd. If you do God's will, you're one of the group. And this picture of Jesus' family standing outside while Jesus' followers are sitting around him kind of portrays Jesus' family as being outsiders at this point. And if there was tension there, that could possibly be true. Right. So yesterday we talked about how the way Jesus was responding in the midst of a lot of tension was through demonstrating grace and forgiveness toward others. But it sounds to me in this passage, Jay, that he's thumbing his nose at his family. Am I wrong to think that?
Well, I think when you read it at first glance and face value, you tend to think that. You're like, what in the world is his issue? I mean, he's responding back to the family in such a way that it's easy for us to get offended by that, trying to put ourselves in that situation. But I don't think Jesus is being rude or disrespectful at all. In fact, I think he's demonstrating to us how to set healthy boundaries. Jesus was all about family and love and those relationships. But he made it very clear here, and he established this pattern, and it applies to us today too, that the first and foremost priority has to be in relationship with him and right standing with God. And then our family after that. He makes it clear that if anyone is more important to us than him, then our priorities are out of order. And he clearly set that boundary here in this exchange.
So if you have family members that don't know Jesus, right, don't follow Christ, it's nearly impossible not to create conflict at some point if we put Jesus first over everything else. Have you ever experienced this in your own family, immediate family, extended family, whatever that looks like? Have you ever experienced conflict that comes from knowing Jesus?
I have seen it through the years. At times would be like when family or friends or extended family maybe wanted to get together, some function. They understood and knew that priority to Jesus, to the church, to your role and responsibilities was priority. and simple comments that you would hear like, well, I know we can't do it then because they're going to be there. They're going to be at church. They're going to, and it was kind of in a snarky kind of way. But at those times, there's an opportunity for you to display as Jesus did what your priority is.
I've seen it more from within my family, but from a kind of an outside perspective where my grandfather was a pastor for his whole career, 50 plus years. And out of the 3 children that they had, my mother was the only one who didn't stray from the faith at some time. So I got to kind of see from the outside the tension that it created to have these 2 family members who decided that they weren't going to follow Jesus for a time. And both of them eventually came back. And I think that, but I got to see kind of the tension that it would cause to that church was the priority and things like that, where that wasn't in their life and they were pained by some of the things that happened in church growing up. And so I think that I got to see it from a very outside perspective because those aunts and uncles didn't live by me. But I definitely saw that as like a warning when I'm in ministry to like make sure that my family doesn't feel like they're on the outside of things.
I'm going to give 2 different ways that I saw this growing up. One, both of my parents were saved. I grew up in a pastor's home, so immediate family, I didn't see any of that. I did see tension when I would stray from the faith, or that would create tension. The 2 places that I recall paying attention as a young person, though, one, so at our intentional conference last year, we had a guy named Michael Ball. He spoke a couple of times. His grandfather's name was J. Ball. His wife was not saved, and he was a preacher.
Mm.
And I remember hearing my dad talk about how much he admired him and how difficult it must have been to be a traveling evangelist and your wife completely not just not support you, but at times be opposed to what you were doing. And then my dad had 2 brothers that didn't follow Christ, the 2 oldest brothers. And one of them at least was said at his funeral that he had an end of life conversion, and committed his life to Christ. The other one did get saved, and it was life changing for him because he was anti-church, anti anything to do with religion. He made it difficult for everybody, when he came around, and he would want to show up on Sunday, but he wouldn't go to church with anybody. It just it created a lot of tension. And later he came to Christ. And I saw how those things resolved, because it is when you don't have that same belief system, it's going to create tension.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to create tension. And, I've watched it over the years. Jesus seems to navigate this pretty well. Were there any particular ways that he handles this that you think were things that we could all apply?
It seems like at that moment, Jesus maybe knew that could have turned into a fight with his family, and that wasn't the time for it. I think that he, like we said, he wasn't being disrespectful. He wasn't, but there was a time and place where maybe they could have that conversation later. And I think that that's a good thing, like for us to consider. Sometimes there are conversations that don't need to happen at certain moments in front of certain people, and we need to learn how to navigate that and be respectful of those situations.
One of the things that stood out to me is he didn't ignore it or pretend it wasn't there. He spoke up and addressed it. And as Alyssa said, I think there was probably some additional conversation that took place at the appropriate time and place for that. But he acknowledged the reality of the tension between family and relationships and doing God's will.
How many brothers did Jesus have? Does anybody know? I'm not asking you because I have the answer
Google's-
off the top of my
I'd
head.
have
Pastor
to-
Google might know.
Yeah, I'd have to
Rabbi Google.
go back and look.
Let's find out. But as while I look, why is there confusion in things like setting healthy boundaries and being disrespectful? What do people confuse about those two things?
I think part of the confusion comes in when you set healthy boundaries. People don't necessarily like the boundary, so therefore they take it personally. They take it as if it's an offense toward them when it probably isn't intended to. And oftentimes people are used to having their way, whatever that looks like. And for somebody to dare put boundaries in place to them, that can be a big point of contention, pushback.
Yeah, most of the time you have to put boundaries with people who are doing bad things. Because if
That's right.
they weren't pushing things the way they shouldn't go, then
You
you
wouldn't
wouldn't
need
have to. The other part of boundaries is that we're not trying to control the other person's actions when it comes to boundaries. We're saying how we are going to
Yes.
react in that situation. And sometimes if that person setting the boundaries tries to control the other person too much in setting this boundary, it's not going to work. It has to be how you are going to react in a certain situation and saying, if you push this boundary, this is how I'm
Right.
going to act. You can't change what that person's going to do. You can only change how you are going to act.
Boundaries are critical and they're important for us to put in place, but we have to be healthy to be able to set healthy boundaries. And one of the things that I see is unhealthy people trying to set boundaries. And when unhealthy people try to set unhealthy boundaries, they set unhealthy boundaries, right? They don't set healthy places. So the scripture says, back to the question that I asked, Mark 6:3 names 4 brothers, James, Joseph, or Joses. I don't know how they would say it, Judas, and Simon, or Joseph. It would be Joseph in some translations. And he also had at least 2 unnamed sisters that we don't have their names, but they're at least 2 unnamed sisters. So, the Catholic Church teaches that she didn't have any other children by Joseph, with Joseph.
No, I think it's
At all. Yes,
Right,
at
right,
all.
yeah.
That was the only child. She didn't have any other children.
Yeah.
I mean, because Joseph is the only husband that we know
Right,
that she
right,
had. Right. But at least our New Testament scriptures acknowledge that she does. So, well, thank you for joining us today on this edition of One Single Story. We hope you'll be back with us tomorrow as we continue a conversation around our daily Bible reading from the One Year Bible.